A sovereign nation, a professional military, a flightless bird? In 1932, the Australian government in Canberra made a decision that, well, it's hard to call it strategic. It was a decision that would go down in the annals of the absurd. They deployed the army to handle an emu pest control operation. On paper, it sounded like simple target practice for the troops. In reality, it became one of the most gloriously unhinged military disasters in history. Just imagine the scene. Soldiers armed with Lewis machine guns staring down 20,000 birds. And the result wasn't a victory. The birds didn't just survive. They outmaneuvered the military with a precision that seemed almost intentional. As the press began mocking the government, they coined a term that would forever stain the history books: the Great Emu War. Headlines screamed that the emus had defeated the Australian army. It was a full-scale military operation with a dedicated budget and industrial firepower, yet it lost to an opponent that cannot even fly. But the true mystery isn't that they lost, it's how the birds organized themselves to ensure it. Western Australia, the Campion district. This is the heart of the Wheatbelt, a vast expanse of scrubland where the horizon stretches until it simply breaks. It is a place of oppressive, shimmering heat and a dust that clings to your skin like a second layer. For millennia, emus had moved through this landscape in a rhythmic, ancestral cycle. But by the early 30s, the balance had shifted. In 1922, the government changed the status of emus from a protected native species to vermin. Suddenly, the birds were no longer treasures of the wilderness, they were targets. Now, the oppressive silence of the outback feels heavy, pregnant with a storm that doesn't bring rain, but feathers and hunger. These men in the fields were not just farmers. They were veterans of the First World War, men who had survived the mud and blood of the trenches only to be dropped into the searing dust of Western Australia. The government had promised them a new life, a reward for their service, but the reality was a bitter pill. The land granted to these veterans was often agriculturally marginal, making crop growth a constant struggle. They were fighting a war against the soil itself, trying to force wheat from an earth that refused to give it. Then the Great Depression struck and the financial floor vanished. The promised subsidies disappeared and wheat prices plummeted, leaving these men trapped in a cycle of debt and desperation. By October 1932, the breaking point had been reached. Roughly 1/4 of the farmers had simply given up, abandoning their land for the cities. For those who stayed, the wheat was more than a crop. It was their final lifeline. They had survived the gunfire of Europe, only to face a slow, grinding bankruptcy in the oppressive silence of the outback. Then came the movement. Emus migrate hundreds of kilometers annually in search of water and food, but the environment had been altered. Severe droughts forced the birds to deviate from their usual path toward the coastline. Instead, they found something far more lucrative: the newly cleared farmland and the man-made water sources of the settler soldiers. The birds arrived in a tide of gray-brown feathers, 20,000 strong. They didn't just graze on the wheat, they demolished it. The financial blow was staggering. Estimates suggest the emus cost farmers millions of pounds in lost revenue. But the birds didn't stop at the harvest. They smashed through the perimeter fences, creating gaping holes that allowed other pests, like rabbits, to flood in and finish the destruction. The farmer's land was no longer a fortress. It was an open invitation for every hungry creature in the outback. Exhausted and broken, these veterans had limited ammunition to fight back. They couldn't win a war of attrition against 20,000 birds. Their plea for government assistance was less of a request and more of a surrender. They wanted their crops saved, but in calling for help, they invited a far more complex disaster into their fields. To understand the failure, you have to look at the target. The emu is a large, flightless bird, but calling it a bird is a tactical error. To the soldiers arriving on the scene, these weren't just animals, they were biological anomalies. Imagine a creature 6 feet tall, weighing up to 120 pounds. That is a massive amount of muscle and bone moving across a dusty plain. And they move fast, up to 40 miles per hour. In the shimmering heat of the wheat belt, a target moving at that speed isn't a mark, it's a blur. The military expected a shooting gallery, but they were facing what effectively functioned as a feathered tank. When you combine that height, that speed, and a hide evolved to survive the harshest environment on Earth, the Lewis machine gun starts to look less like a solution and more like a toy. The Army thought they were hunting birds. They were actually engaging an opponent that could outrun their vehicles and absorb impacts that would have felled a man. But the biological specs were only half the story. As the soldiers watched the flocks, they noticed something that defied their military training. The birds weren't just running in a blind panic, they were operating with a surprising, instinctual organization. Major Meredith observed that each flock had a leader, a large black-plumed bird that stood sentinel. This sentinel stood watch while the others grew complacent in the wheat, eating and grazing. The moment the soldiers approached, the sentinel would alert the others with a single sharp trap. One single bird stood guard, and the rest of the flock vanished into the scrub in a dozen different directions. This effectively functioned as guerrilla warfare. The military had trained for concentrated masses of targets, but the birds had instinctively adopted a sentinel system. The Army was no longer fighting a bird, they were fighting an opponent that knew how to divide and conquer. A professional army with machine guns was being outsmarted by a system of feathered sentinels. November 1932, the Royal Australian Artillery arrives in the Wheatbelt. Leading the operation is Major Meredith. He doesn't bring a squad of infantry. He brings the industrial weight of the Great War. His unit is equipped with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. 2 guns, 10,000 bullets. To the military mind, this wasn't a pest control problem, it was a tactical operation. The assumption was simple. The Emus were the target and the machine guns were the inevitable solution. There was a profound hubris in believing that a few thousand rounds and the discipline of the artillery could simply erase a biological crisis. They viewed the outback as a target range and the birds as stationary marks. The confidence was absolute. Major Meredith believed he held the only weapon that mattered, unaware that he was about to encounter an enemy that didn't follow a single page of the military manual. November 2, 1932, the first operation begins. Major Meredith and his men move into position, guns primed, waiting for the mass of feathers to enter the kill zone. They expected a massacre. Instead, they received a lesson in humility. Out of the thousands of birds facing them, only 12 emus were killed in the first engagement. The military's precision was useless against an enemy that didn't fight like a soldier. Desperate to close the gap, Meredith attempted mobile warfare. He mounted a machine gun on the back of a truck, intending to hunt the birds down in the open. It was a disaster. The terrain was too rugged for the shooter to aim, turning the weapon into a vibrating piece of scrap metal. Worse, the birds were simply faster. The emus outran the trucks, weaving through the scrub with an agility the heavy vehicles couldn't match. In the chaos of the chase, the emus actually managed to flip one military truck and leave another bogged down in the dust. The hunters had become the hunted, outmaneuvered by a creature that cannot even fly. 300 emus. That was the final tally after several weeks of intervention. The Army had arrived with the confidence of a professional force, but the results were a staggering failure. When you analyze the amount of ammunition spent versus the actual body count, the gap is absurd. Thousands of rounds were fired, yet only a few hundred birds fell. It is a humiliation that lingers. The military didn't just lose a tactical battle, they lost their dignity in the same dust they tried to conquer. The birds simply outran the machine guns, turning a sovereign military operation into a global laughingstock. Inside the Australian House of Representatives, the laughter was cold. One politician questioned if medals were being awarded to the emus, noting that the birds had won every round and that the survivors of the campaign deserved to be honored. The embarrassment was too much to bear. On November 8, 1932, the first military operation was halted. With disappointing results and negative media coverage mounting, the government withdrew the troops. But the birds did not stop. As the attacks on the wheat fields intensified after the withdrawal, the government was forced into a second military operation. Major Meredith was called back into the field, sent to fight a war against an enemy that had already proven the Royal Australian Artillery's firepower was a fantasy. It is a strange, cold irony that the military's industrial force failed where a simple, decentralized bounty worked. By 1934, the government abandoned the army and introduced a reward system for anyone who killed an emu. This wasn't a military operation, it was a price on the head of the bird. This shift moved the burden from the soldiers to the locals. A similar system had been attempted in 1923, but now it was the only practical way to solve the crisis. Why did a professional army with machine guns fail where individuals with a single rifle and a financial incentive succeeded? The legacy of the Emu War remains a lingering image of hubris, the army's failure against a target that didn't even know it was in a war. The only way to win was to stop treating it as a military operation and start treating it as a practical problem. The math of this war is brutal in its irony. The Royal Australian Artillery deployed the most advanced weaponry of the era, yet they suffered a crushing defeat against an opponent that cannot even fly. The operation failed because it tried to treat a biological crisis like a battlefield, viewing birds as infantry rather than animals. The only way the government actually solved the problem was by abandoning the army and switching to a decentralized approach. The results were immediate and devastating. Under the bounty system, farmers and hunters killed 57,000 emus in 6 months. The birds were finally beaten, not by a military strategy, but by a simple payment. The outback returns to its shimmering, dusty silence, leaving behind a record of the only war where the medals were almost awarded to the emus.